Mr. Goldstein, how are you?
Oh, I'm very fine. Listen, just call me Sam, okay?
Okay, I will call you Sam. Very nice to meet you this morning. I'm going to briefly introduce you before we start talking about what I want to interview you about today.
Please do.
So I know people know you in the criminal law world, but just briefly, you're a criminal lawyer and you've been practicing for 27 years. You started off as a crown. You've argued cases in front before all levels of courts, including the Supreme Court of Canada. You're a former director for Brene Breath, and you were a bencher elected in 2019 as part of this slate that wanted to stop the statement of principle, and then you ran as an independent in 2023. So this is actually what I want to talk to you about today. It's this whole problem or scandal that we had recently with the Law Society. You were a bencher, so you know a little bit how it works out there. Um, just let's talk a bit about the problem that happened with the Law Society, and that was all the behind the scenes payments that were happening with the CAO, and that to everybody's surprise, nobody was aware of what was happening. So what I want to talk about is two things. It's this problem itself, the what was happening at the Law Society behind everybody's backs, and only a few were aware of that, but also the reaction of the bar to that. Like, why did it take so long for people to do anything? Eventually, I mean, we did have a reaction that pushed the Law Society to disclose finally the report that they had, but that was also problematic. So I'll let you start first by talking about this whole problem from your perspective. You're actually, to your credit, you're one of the few who was very vocal about this situation.
Well, thank you, Maya. Well, first of all, let's just talk about the problem of what happened a little bit.
Mhm.
And so, very, very briefly, in the end of 2024, just around the fall period of time, it came to light that there was a compensation package that doubled the salary of Diana Miles, who's the chief executive
Yeah.
officer, the CEO of the Law Society. That was an agreement between a small select people who were on a compensation committee. And those people, and as the O'Connor report, and I'll get into that in a moment, has revealed that the named people, at least, who were involved in agreeing to that compensation package were people like Sid Troyster, Megan Shortreed, Benture, and primarily Jackie Horvath, who was then the treasurer of the Law Society. They agreed to this compensation package, and the key thing is that they didn't recommend that the approval for the compensation package should then go to convocation as it has been in the past, and then convocation approves it. So it was kept away from convocation, which is the meeting of all benchers that they meet and vote on different issues and approve things. That was kept away from convocation. It came out that she had this compensation package. It was leaked to the Toronto Star, which then ran a story on it. And then subsequently, when the profession heard about that compensation package
From the
uh,
media.
from the media, yes, not from benchers
Yeah.
themselves, then, and I'm not sure what the sequence was, but the convocator, the Law Society, which is now led by Peter Wardle, who's the treasurer, didn't want, resisted a public investigation of that. Justice O'Connor was then a retired Spirit Court judge, was hired to investigate. He released the O'Connor report, and then there was pressure amongst the profession to release the O'Connor report, which was eventually done with some redacted names. And it described the process of what happened. And one of the essential findings that the O'Connor report came up with is that the it just seemed to be that people didn't for the irony was that the group of people who say that they were elected to bring good governance
Mhm.
to the Law Society were practicing not good governance, the complete opposite, by not bringing it to
Mhm.
the convocation. And O'Connor said this is an issue which clearly should have that convocation should have approved.
I wanted to ask you here because I mean, you were a bencher, so you kind of know what's going on here or how things were going on. I don't know if things have changed, but the issue that I see is that I think it's problematic that some benchers were involved, obviously, in what was going on, and not everyone. And also, another problem is that, well, what about the others? Like, how come also there were some benchers who had no idea about what was going on? Like, what is going on inside the Law Society? I mean, I find it shocking either way. Even those who say, well, I had no idea this was happening behind my back, I find that this as well is problematic. So, what is
Yeah,
happening?
well, I think the key, the key issue what's going on at the Law Society is that there is a sense of there's a lack of transparency
Hmm.
and accountability at the
Yeah.
Law Society. And I think the O'Connor report brought that out. And then there's the other report, Hansel, a law firm by the name of Hansel and McLaughlin, who specialize in governance issues, sort of did a review of the O'Connor report and then what's known in the media and sort of talked their own analysis of what happened. And I think we could all, and now what's being suggested as the remedy, at least Peter Wardle is saying, well, the O'Connor report suggested amendments to the bylaws, and now they have to appoint a committee to adopt these bylaws, which were common sense to begin with. Like convocation has to approve things. You don't need to put everything into statutory form in order to understand basic governance principles.
Hmm.
But apparently these people think that's necessary. My point is that it is a systemic, it's a cultural issue, and that's one of the issues that in the Hansel McLaughlin report, I think when Ms. Hansel was actually being interviewed by one of the legal journals, she talked about it's a cultural problem at the Law Society. So no manner of tinkering with the bylaws is going to solve the problem. There's an ingrained cultural problem, and that ingrained cultural problem is basically contempt for the profession that
Yeah.
these people called the Good Governance
Hmm.
Coalition, which was actually a not-for-profit corporation. And we can get into that in a moment. These people who are running the law, so I think they know better, that they were, the cognoscenti, the select, and they know how to run the law society, and no one else does. And that was clearly very, evident in their campaign, where they accused people like me, who were part of the slate initially, as being unfit to govern. And they knew what was right in this world, and it's that type of attitude which continues to persist. I mean, you saw I made a complaint underneath the Benture Code of Conduct about the activities of Sid Troyster and Megan Shortreed as a result of the O'Connor report. And the response to that was, well, we've done nothing wrong. And I made another complaint about now the Benture Code of Conduct requires the treasurer to do an investigation. But then after the Hansel McLaughlin report came out and started talking about Peter Wardle's role in this, I thought that it was improper for him to do the investigation. There's a section in the Benture Code of Conduct which says that it's inappropriate for the treasurer to do an investigation. Someone else should be appointed. Wardle has acknowledged both of my letters. I don't know what's happening.
Hmm.
Before the O'Connor report came out, I also made the Judicial Council of Canada complaint, Canadian Judicial Council complained about Jackie Horvath and said that it was improper for her to continue being a judge, given we didn't know what her role was in the whole affair. I think despite the fact that she's now a judge, some reprimand should happen to her too for her lack of understanding about basic governance principles. But again, the key is that I think the takeaway I want people to have is that it's a cultural problem at the Law Society, and no matter of tinkering is going to solve it. And what really has to do is the profession has to take back the Law Society in 2027.
So, what do you mean specifically by that? So, should there be a change in the structure of the Law Society, or should there be a different body that governs the profession? Like, what does that
Yeah,
mean?
so no, I'm talking about 2027 as the next Benture election. I'm just
Hmm.
saying that the legal profession has to come out and vote these people out. And there
Hmm.
has to be a whole new group of people who have governance experience, not just, that they were part of some organization, part of some group. Let me just take you back a little
Yeah.
bit and why I talk about it's a cultural issue. I think you got to go back to, uh, look, let me start this way. Regulatory bodies have to be neutral. Okay. And they're delegated authority. So back in around sometime around Mike Harris, before McGuinty Gate in the early 2000s or maybe late 90s, the government got rid of all regulating funeral directors and the accountants and lawyers, and where lawyers are always had self independence, but there was a whole bunch of real estate agents. There was a whole bunch of professional bodies that the government had been regulating, and they wanted to divest themselves of that responsibility. And so they created all these different, legislation to allow for self-regulation in these many different professions. So believe me, when the Good Governance Coalition talked about what's at stake is loss of self-regulation, it was just complete propaganda. The government doesn't want to regulate such a vociferous profession as a bunch of lawyers. They never did. They don't want to. So I'm not suggesting that somehow we disband the Law Society, but I am suggesting that we relook at what the focus of the Law Society should be doing. In 2004, 2006, what you had is underneath the McGuinty government, you had Section 4.1 of the Law Society Act talks about the functions of the Law Society. And the function of the Law Society is about keeping competency and ethics, making sure that lawyers have integrity and lawyers who know what they're doing. The McGuinty government amended the Law Society Act to include 4.2, which had a section which said, and in performing the functions of the Law Society has to look at these principles, and the principles are access to justice, transparency, and some other principles. That really was like a Trojan horse for that generation of benchers to bring in their own sort of political agenda into the Law Society. And that's what's sort of going on now, is that you have a mission creep of what the Law Society is really about. And they want to engage in functions which I think which should be the purview of government. And so the Law Society, which again, really as a regulatory body, should be a neutral body, has become very politicized by this group of people. And that was evident again in the statement of principles, and why there are people like me who said, well, listen, I have no problem if you want to engage in some sort of, if you personally believe in environmentalism or personally believe in Marxism or personally believe in the social justice ideology that's pervasive in society today. Listen, you can go ahead and do that. That's in my world, a small L liberal democratic world. We have a pluralistic society. So I know, that should be allowed. As an individual lawyer, you can engage in causes, but they wanted the Law Society itself to take on the cause. And that's where you start having significant problems. And let me just give you two examples of something of this. And I'm going to go back into history. So in 1838, when the Upper Canada rebellions against the Family Compact in Upper and Lower Canada, what ended up happening is that those lawyers who were not part of the Family Compact, the Law Society was actually disciplining them and preventing certain people from becoming lawyers. Mm-hmm. That's an example of when that ideology, when the neutrality of a regulatory body becomes infected by political agenda. You also had that again in World War I, when you had those lawyers in Ontario who disagreed with Canada's involvement in the First World War. And there was a lawyer who said that we shouldn't be involved in it. And he was disciplined as a result of that, because he was seen as not being Canadian enough. So this is what happens when you have a regulatory body takes over a political agenda. And that's what we're having going on at the Law Society. Mm-hmm. And what's worse is that the political agenda at the Law Society is based upon this social justice and identity politics. So if you disagree with people like that, then there really are ideologues. If you disagree with them, then you are offending their personal identity. And there's no ability to have reasonable people can disagree on things. And I hate to say this, but they're the ones who aren't being reasonable. They can't accept that people can disagree with them. And so it's not a matter, and this is what happened in the last election, right? It's not a matter that you disagree with how they want to go about doing things. It's that you are unfit to govern. That's how it manifests itself. And so some of the things that personally that I tried to raise, for example, was, what exactly, how many, what is the accountability and the transparency of the Law Society in terms of its own finances? How many people actually work at the Law Society? I could never get an answer. And it was funny. If you want to share, can we just share the screen for a moment?
Sure.
So I'm just
Um,
going to, how do we, okay, I'm hitting share. And you'll see here, do you see it? No, how
so
do,
I see your screen. Yes.
okay, so you see this graph. Now this table here was taken from a book by Christopher Moore that was written in 1995
Mhm.
on the history of the Law Society. It's a great book. Suggest people read it. And here in this book, Table 3, in the back of the book, you could find out from 1950 to 1945
Mhm.
how many people actually worked at the Law Society. Law Society won't tell you that, but we have a history book which looked at the Human Resources Department statistics from 1986 to 1995. How many people work there? But now remember last year the Law Society voted. Benchers voted that if you have a question about some aspect of the Law Society, like its finances or how many people work there, you can't ask the staff. You have to ask the treasurer, and then the treasurer has the final decision as to whether he or she will decide to answer your question. That's the lack of transparency.
Right. And do we not have a table, a similar table for after 1995?
No, no,
Okay, so
we don't.
19, okay.
Okay, so now I just happened to um, be looking at the Law Society on the LinkedIn page, and then guess what? You could find out how many people work at the Law Society and what they do on the LinkedIn page. If you go to Law Society, you go underneath Insights, and I think you have to have a paid subscription for this information. This is based upon data that LinkedIn has collected on its own in terms of how many people from the Law Society employees are on LinkedIn, right? So you can go on LinkedIn, and the LinkedIn will tell you that there's 751 employees of at the Law Society, and it will tell you what the growth rate is. In the last 2 years, the growth rate in employees have gone up 6%, and they'll tell you sort of what the breakdown is. And so now you can't get this information from. I mean, isn't it bizarre that you can't get the information from the Law Society, but you can get it from a book that was written in 1995.
Yeah.
Get it from information from LinkedIn, but the Law Society itself won't tell you this information. Now
Do
that's
they
this.
have this information?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if
Because
they have.
because one of the issues that we've realized from the O'Connor report is that there isn't really good practice within the Law Society. Nobody was taking notes. I don't know if that is true or if that's what they said only, but it seems like nobody was taking notes or proper notes. So, do they have good practice inside the Law Society of keeping these statistics and tracking things?
Well, that's a good point. And O'Connor, I mean, clearly, when the people that O'Connor interviewed, like Megan Short-Reed
Yeah.
and Sid Fisher and so on, I think it was Megan Short-Reed who said that. Well, she said she didn't know what the mandate of her committee was. It's called the Compensation Committee. O'Connor had looked for notes and couldn't provide any
Yeah.
notes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it just seems that, for if we did that, Maya, if the law sign knocked on your door to do a spot audit
Mhm.
and you didn't keep the notes of some meeting with a client, they would be after you. But it
Yeah.
seems to me that, you know, they don't have to do it at all as our governors. So,
Yeah.
there's some serious problems. But again, I want people to understand that this isn't simply a matter of you can do some sort of remedial, that the law side just has to engage in some remedial work like we lawyers sometimes have to do in remedial education with respect to keeping a trust book. It is a ingrained cultural problem within the benchers that are there now. That group there now believe that they're better than you and I, and they don't have to follow the rules, and that they know how to govern, and that we don't. And it's that attitude and that lack of transparency and accountability that continues. And that's why I say we have to take back the Law Society in 2027.
Well, and what the other problem that we are encountering now right now is this trust issue, because I think now there is no trust between the lawyers, the profession, and its regulator, the law society. Like, how can we trust the law society moving forward?
Yeah, that's certainly a problem. And they think again that Peter Wardle saying, well, you could trust us because we're going to adopt the bylaws. Although if they're going to adopt the bylaws, why do they have to appoint a committee to to study the bylaws that
Yeah,
he is suggesting, right? But the as usual, the cover up is worse than the scandal. If the law
yeah.
society only would have come out initially and said, look, there was a mistake, you're right, we're going to fix it. The people responsible are going to be kicked off the committees, then I think everyone would just say, okay, fine, then we would get on with our lives. But the resistance to disclosing what happened,
Yeah.
it just worsened and exacerbated the distrust that you're talking about amongst the legal profession. And I don't think we should have any trust in these people, this good governance coalition. We should, we have 2 years before 2027, the next election, and we should be voting them all out. Now, interesting enough, the treasurer's position is every year there's an election. Peter Wardle's coming up for election in June, and
Mhm.
it'll be interesting to see whether he will be reelected or not.
But I mean, whether he is, or let's even if we assume that he is not reelected, I mean, that's not the solution to the problem.
No, no. Again, I think no matter who, you've got so many barriers to transparency there. So, you in two prior to my election, 2019, they had this thing called the Benture Code of Conduct. And when you read it, it was interesting because there's a number of sections there about, essentially not asking the staff any questions. And you remember the people like Megan and Sid in the O'Connor report and the findings of the O'Connor report were saying that, well, we just kept trusting the staff. We didn't have to do anything. All we have to do, in my interpretation is eat butter tarts, which apparently people, I'm not a butter tart lover, but apparently Law Society used to have really good butter tarts when it had a restaurant. But it's almost this attitude that we don't want to be disturbed by governance. We just want to go out and eat our butter tarts, and we'll leave all the decision making to the staff. Well, the staff clearly didn't know what they were doing, and the staff didn't give them the good advice at all. You can't, you're elected to govern. You're elected to use some judgment. You can't just abrogate that judgment, that decision making process to the staff, and that's what they were doing. And I don't know if that. I don't think they realize that as of yet. I mean, certainly when you have I think it was a Law Times article, when you have the benchers who were questioned, who were pointed out, singled out in the O'Connor report saying, well, we did nothing wrong. It's dumbfounding that they can continue believing that they did nothing wrong.
Well, I mean, and one thing that you did mention is that there's a culture problem within the
Yeah,
law society. And if that culture doesn't change, I'm not too optimistic about how things are going to be any better. So, I mean, it seems like their whole internal culture has to shift and has
yeah,
to,
and that culture has to be that we have to be focusing on the fact that as a regulatory body where you have authority being delegated down, you have to respect what your limitations are. You have to keep in your lane. And again, I think that's a big problem of it, right? And so I'm suggesting the first thing that I think the Law Society should do, and there's an AGM coming up in September 18th. So I think this is a good focus for the profession to maybe bring some motions. But one of the motions I want to bring is to talk about how the Law Society should adopt an independent audit of the finances and an independent audit of the seat count and what people do, right? If you're not about, if you're performing a function that's outside of the function of, if you're performing a job that's outside the function of competency and ethics, then why are you there? Um, and my friend Anita Zaghetti has been talking about bringing a motion about getting the cost of all these reports and the cost of. I find it shocking that when the sort of scandal broke, the Law Society hired a PR firm to deal with like
yeah,
the image of it. And I mean, why do you need to have a PR
with our
firm?
money.
Yeah, with our money,
Yeah.
you know, they want to hire a firm to uh, pay money to a firm to tell us why they shouldn't hand over the report, right? I mean, it, it's just amazing. And but our money is being spent in all different ways. The budget isn't really give you an idea of what actually is being spent at the Law Society. I remember speaking to one of the treasurers, it was Teresa Donnelly, saying, I want a breakdown of where all this money is going. And she said to me, well, we do it in such a ways where there's a treasurer budget. Okay, so the money goes to the treasurer budget, and we don't go into the details of the treasurer, where the money that the treasurer gets to spend. And that treasurer budget, I think it's somewhere in $1 million. And we don't get to see how the treasurer spends that money at all. But it's just sort of listed as management. There's these big, big general headlines within the budget that is issued to the public, to the profession. But it doesn't go into very much details about where that all money is going. And you remember, I think the city of Oshawa, which is just east of Toronto,
Mm-hmm.
I think that city's budget is about $155 million. And the Law Society's budget is, I think, more than $155 million now. So we're spending as much as a city, but we have less sort of transparency and accountability as to where that money is going.
Yeah, and communication between the law society and the profession is also a problem. I mean, we hardly ever hear directly from people who are in the law society. I mean, the emails that I get mostly are about paying fees, the annual report, buying CPD programs, but we don't really get too much contact with the benchers and the law society, I find.
Well, let me push back a little bit. Let me defend the law sign benchers on that level. um, I think in fairness to them, listen, we have 65,000 professionals, and that includes the paralegals. And it's hard for everyone to get informed. All the law society can do is to send out, they used to send out letters, and now they send out emails. But there's nothing preventing people from going up to a bencher and saying, what's going on. Now, maybe a bencher will feel because of the bencher code of conduct they can't talk to you, which I think that's
Mhm.
the problem,
Yeah.
right? I see no reason why the treasurer can't have a day where if you got an issue, go to like your local MP, go speak to your treasurer. I mean, you could always phone the treasurer up, although there's layers to get through to the treasurer. So I think you could open up a little bit to the public. But I think the real issue is that bencher code of conduct makes benchers feel that they can't talk about what's going on.
And that was part of the frustration in this whole situation is that benchers were slowly getting some information, but whatever they were getting, they weren't able to disclose or share with the rest of the profession. And that was what caused so much frustration before the O'Connor report was finally released to the profession. But again, on this whole communication issue, I mean, it still was problematic because at the end of the day, I mean, we learned about it through the Toronto Star instead of
Yeah.
hearing first directly from the Law Society. Eventually, the treasurer did send out, we did receive emails from them, but that took a long time. And that was part of the problem is that why did it take so long for us to have direct communication about this issue from the Law Society when the media clearly had more information than us?
Yeah, well, Treasurer Wardle even said to people, warned the benchers not to talk about it,
Mhm.
and then threatened them with the bencher code of conduct. So yeah, again, it's just that this lack of transparency and accountability, that culture,
Yeah.
which I think manifests itself out of this sense of which that they think that they know better on how to govern, and the other reason why people didn't want to go to convocation, why, as you might remember in the O'Connor report, Diana Malza went to Malcolm Mercer when he was treasurer, and she consistently had wanted a raise. I mean, I think at that time she was getting $350,000, and she didn't think it was enough. The stressors of running the law society. I don't know what stress she wants to have stress. She should run a practice like you or me, right? I mean, that's really stressful. But she, runs this organization where people give her money, and there's no issues of raising money at all. But it was stressful for her. 350, I'll take her job for $350,000 and deal with her stresses. But Malcolm Mercer wrote back to her and said, well, the composition of the convocation isn't such that they're going to be open to you giving you a raise.
Yeah.
And then when in 2023, when the Good Governance Coalition more or less ran the table, but for three or four people who ran in the sort of second iteration of the slate, um, Diane Miles wrote, and it's that letter, she says, well, now that sanity has returned to the Law Society, right, or sanity's returned to convocation, which I just found so insulting. And then she went back to this concept. She wanted more money, right? And then and they didn't want to go to convocation. Now I'm not, my suspicion is, and I think you could sort of read between the lines, is that they didn't want to go back and get convocation to approve it. I think they knew that they had to get approval, but they didn't want to get approval because they didn't want those members who were not part of the Good Governance Coalition to pose any opposition to it, to cause them any trouble. Because their friend Diane Miles, was going to get one. They wanted to give her the raise. And I think it's a little bit of cronyism. I also think, if you remember, you go back to the Connor report, there was a concern that when she said, she says, well, if you don't recognize my stressors, then I'm going to leave. Essentially, that's what she's saying. And then I think the response was, if I can remember correctly, was that, oh, we have to give her this money because, we don't know who else could run the Law Society. There's lots of people out there who could run the Law Society. And obviously, there's lots of people who could run the Law Society better than she did. There's a number of problems.
And for less.
Sorry?
And for less money.
Yeah, and for less money than $1 million. So, that's why I say the problems are all cultural, that group of people who are running and have to be removed in 2027. And I want to go back to something which I said is, the Good Governance Coalition was a corporation. It was incorporated, I think 2 or 3 years before the election. The directors some of them were benchers, some of them were lawyer benchers, some of them were paralegal benchers. And they funneled money through that corporation. Now think of it. They had a website, they had professional videos, they had robot calls calling up people saying, vote for us. I think they had mailers, I can't quite remember, but they spent a lot. They hired a professional government relation campaign manager. My estimations when I spoke to people who were in the campaign industry is about $250,000 that they spent on that campaign. And we'll never really know how much they spent on it because the corporation, the Good Governance Corporation, has not filed its federal financials at all. So we'll never actually know how much they spent. Now, I'm sure individual benchers who ran for them may have just contributed some money, but $250,000 is a lot of money, and that had to come from somewhere. And now, if you look at the statistics on the Law Society website about who voted and who didn't vote, you see that the vast majority of people who voted were from large firms. And so the Good Governance Coalition was getting the backing of Bay Street. Now, I want to just talk about something, and it'll make sense in just a moment. We in Ontario elect benchers from different areas of Ontario, geographic zones, right? And it's because the practice of law is different in Northern Ontario than it might be in Toronto, and different out in Ottawa than it might be in Southern Ontario and Windsor and so on, right? And that's because there's geographic differences and resources. The Law Society, as far back as 1792, when it was first enacted, came to be, always recognized the regional discrepancies in Ontario than Upper Canada. And over time, they also recognized that we had to add more benchers to the Law Society in order to get more representation from the regions. And that in 1802 or 1804, they expanded the number of benchers to incorporate that. But even though you had an expansion of the number or an increase in the number of benchers from across Ontario, there was always still a recognition the vast majority of people were coming from the large firms, Bay Street and Toronto. And hence over time you had this division of 20 people had to come from outside Toronto and 20 people were from inside Toronto. But there's always been, one of the tensions is not just simply geography, but one of the tensions is also Bay Street versus Main Street, the Bay Street lawyer versus the Main Street lawyer. In addition to in the 1990s, you had the issue of, I think it was fees on real estate, because at that time the interest rates went down, or there was a, no, sorry, there was a number of real estate um, mortgage frauds that took place, and so the compensation package had to be increased and so on. And so the solicitors were upset about the increased fees that, or the increased levies that they were going to have to pay on certain issues. And so that in the 1990s, you had people like Larry Bannock and Gary Gottlieb and Bob Aaron and a number of other solicitors who then got elected on that sort of tension within the profession, right? So there's always going to be little tensions, and so I personally don't think that slates are a bad idea, although I think the profession may have gotten a little bit tired of the slates. I don't think they should be gotten rid of. I think we should have electoral reform, and the electoral reform should be that you can't be funneling money through a incorporated body. I think that should be dealt with. But it's these little tensions. But now what we have here is we have the Good Governance Coalition, seemingly, I think one can reasonably conclude that the increase of the Bay Street law firms coming out and voting, they were voting for the Good Governance Coalition. And we know that they had people inside the Bay Street law firms acting as whips to get people out and vote for them. I think it's concerning that Bay Street has so much power within the Law Society, and that's a
Yeah,
tradition.
yeah.
It's always been a traditional concern. So there's all these other things that are going on within the Law Society, which I don't think people are always sort of cognizant. Again, the issue in terms of representation of Bentures, it's not about based upon your identity, because we're all lawyers.
Yeah.
In terms of the Law Society, what's really the issues is where you're from in terms of Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
But the Law Society has gotten into this idea, this obeisance, this slavish obeisance to this social justice politics, that identity is more important than where you're from in Ontario. And so even in the last convocation, you had Treasurer Wardle talking about the composition of some financial committee. And the first issue that came up was, well, we have to make sure that the identity of who's going to be on that committee, we have to make sure that all the different identities are represented. And I'm thinking it's a financial committee. Don't you think that your first concern should be that the people are on that committee, let alone know what the governance issues are, but have some knowledge of finances and some knowledge of reading financial budgets and statements? I mean, don't you think that's more important than simply this, as I called it, slavish obedience to some sort of social justice ideology? And that's what we're really sort of, missing at the Law Society, is this sort of a common sense concept that what really matters as a profession, we don't exist unless there's a client. And we should be focusing on the client, and the way we make sure that there is good governance and that the public are really protected is if we have good lawyers who know the law, and good lawyers who are ethical. That is in the public interest.
So I want to ask you, and I know I've been taking a lot of your time and you have to go on vacation, but I do want to ask you, are you planning on running again? If you're
Well,
like, yeah.
we'll see. I'm not ruling it out. I'm not saying I
Okay.
am at this point, but I do think in some form that, as I end off almost all my interviews with, is we have to take back the Law Society in 2027.
Mhm. So, and I think that more of us should be more engaged in what is happening with the Law
Yeah,
Society.
listen, I encourage you to run.
Well, I mean, you have more experience, so
Well,
you know.
listen, just to finish off, I think I encourage everyone who's dissatisfied with what's going on, that they have an obligation then to act upon their dissatisfaction and to either participate in the election either by actually running, or participate in the election by voting,
Mhm.
or participating by helping other people run. I mean,
Yeah.
I think the point is, yes, I only have experience in terms of governing. I've been parts of different bodies. I was on different committees, different boards of directors of local community organizations in Toronto, and the director of legal affairs for B'nai B'rith and so on. But we need people with governance experience, and this group of people who are running law. So I went around and sort of found people who fit sort of certain identities and believed in their political agenda. And they overlooked the fact that they didn't have that sort of governance experience.
Yeah.
So I think, we should be looking to vote people who have governance experience. That's first and foremost, right? And we have to return the Law Society to a neutral regulatory body.
Yeah. I
Take
agree.
back the Law Society in
Yeah.
2027.
So that's the message we will be leaving everyone with. But I want to thank you, Sam, for taking the time today to chat with me about that. And I know you've been personally very vocal about this issue. And I mean, it is important for us as a profession. And I'm sure we'll have more to talk about, and we'll have another interview to follow up and see how things are evolving with the Law Society. I mean,
Yes, I
it's
look forward
not
to it.
it's just the beginning. Like we still have lots to follow up on. So I hope we'll have another interview and we'll continue this conversation.
I look forward to it. It's great meeting you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.